They thought they were showing dominance, executing a young human girl on a live interstellar broadcast, her body erased in a flash of blue flame. But what they really did was unlock the end of their empire. Because in just 27 minutes, the most feared regime in the galaxy would collapse without a single shot fired. And the girl they thought they'd silenced, she was already inside their machines, inside their systems, inside their minds. She wasn't a martyr, she was the key. Stay with me, because what happened next changed the fate of 1,000 worlds, forever. They laughed, not the laughter of joy or amusement, but that cold, metallic echo that only comes from creatures who have forgotten fear and mercy. Inside the black marble chamber of the Vaelorian High Command, the air was colder than it should have been, humming faintly with the low vibrations of orbiting war stations. A semicircle of towering Dominion warlords sat encased in jeweled exosuits, their eyes like cut obsidian, expressionless. 1,000 worlds knelt beneath them, billions of lives bent under their command. And today they believed they had crushed the last ember of Earth's defiance. The girl on the broadcast, Nara Sloane, her voice still rang in the air, unsettling in its calm. "In 27 minutes, she had said, your sky will fall." A junior advisor scoffed. Another smirked. General Khatun, whose claws had once shredded a rebel child for speaking out of turn, muttered under his breath, "Primitive dramatics." "Execute the anomaly," came the order from the central throne, where Archregent Vael Syrinx lounged like a spider over its web. He did not blink. He never did. The Neuroflash protocol was a masterpiece of terror. Instantaneous, silent, and agonizingly elegant. A cascade of blue-white flame danced over Nara's body. One moment she knelt beneath the trispires of the Dominion crest, the next, she was gone. Not a scream. Not a spark left behind, just silence. But in that silence something lingered. The crowd watching across the galaxy saw only victory. The Dominion's message was clear: Earth is broken, resistance is death, submit or be vapor. But deep in the void, hidden inside the fractured shell of an abandoned mining station carved into a Class IV asteroid belt, something stirred. A single ship sat anchored in the shadows, invisible to Dominion sensors, quiet as a breath held too long. Its hull was scarred, patched with human hands and hope, painted with code that shimmered only when you looked sideways. Inside, every console glowed low amber, pulsating in sync with something ancient and alive. Captain Myra Vance stood at the helm, eyes locked on a display that mirrored the last image of Nara's execution. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry, her voice barely a whisper. "It's done," she said. Beside her, Lieutenant Chorus, a half-blood born between war zones, tightened his jaw. "You really think this will work?" Myra didn't answer. She just stared at the ticking countdown, 27 minutes. "She's more than just a martyr," Chorus added, unable to hide the ache behind his words. "No," Myra said finally, "she's the key." Beneath the bridge, sealed in the quantum bay, a low-frequency hum began to rise, resonating with the artificial gravity core. The ship was no longer just a ship. It was a conductor, a lens, a weapon made of logic, entanglement, and sacrifice. And the girl they had killed, she was still speaking, not through words, not even through data, but through the ripple of her death, now spread like a virus across the Dominion's pulse net. Her consciousness, mirrored in quantum strands, had seeded itself inside the Empire's bloodstream. Every broadcast tower, every relay satellite, every command ship, it had all become part of her nervous system. The Vaelorians had laughed. They thought Earth was chaos wrapped in flesh. Too emotional, too reactive. Too wild to play the long game. But they had never studied Earth's true nature. Never understood that emotion wasn't weakness, it was the weapon. That strategy was never just a matter of strength, it was how much you were willing to lose to win. And Earth had just sacrificed a daughter, not because she was disposable, but because she was irreplaceable. The rebels knew the Dominion would televise the execution. The Dominion always did. It was part of their theater, their performance of power. And that was the mistake. In broadcasting Nara's death, they had opened every door, given her signal access to every listening ear, every eye, every system. Now those systems were waking up, not all at once, but soon. Myra reached for the final activation crystal, her hand hovering. In the reflection of the console, she saw Nara's face again, defiant, brave, lit by a light no longer visible in this world. "Their sky will fall," Myra whispered. "But not from above. From within," and she pressed the key. She stood like stone, her silhouette etched against the dim glow of the ship's main holoscreen. Captain Myra Vance didn't blink. Outside the viewport, stars drifted in cold silence, unaware they were moments from witnessing the unraveling of an empire. Her breath was slow, measured like someone holding back the tide inside her chest. Around her, the command deck buzzed faintly. Machines alive with secrets, humans holding on to hope like it might shatter if touched too hard. "Nara isn't dead," she finally said. The words floated through the room, unreal at first, like the echo of something impossible. All heads turned toward her. Her officers, some hardened by years in the shadows, others young, still carrying the shine of rebellion in their eyes, stared at her in disbelief. "We never lost her," Myra continued, her voice low but firm, tinged with that dangerous calm only found in those who have already walked through fire. "We sent her." Lieutenant Chorus flinched, the memory of Nara's disintegration still fresh in his mind. He had watched it happen, every pixel of it burned into the back of his eyelids. The flame, the silence, the emptiness left behind, but now this. How, he asked, not out of doubt, but desperation, like a drowning man clinging to the shape of a lifeboat he couldn't see. Myra didn't answer right away. She turned to the holodisplay behind her. With a swipe of her palm, the screen lit up with neural maps, quantum lattice structures, cascading code that shimmered like the surface of black water under moonlight. "She was a volunteer," Myra said quietly. "The clone we sent wasn't just a copy, she was a quantum echo. Every neuron, every memory, every heartbeat patterned from the original. But more than that, she was entangled." She gestured to the center of the map where a golden thread pulsed across dimensions. "We threaded her consciousness, anchored it to our system, to this ship, to me." A hush fell, no one dared speak. "She saw what they'd do to her," Myra continued, "and she stepped forward anyway. Not because she wanted revenge, not even because she hated them. She volunteered because she believed in this, in what comes next." The ship's AI blinked into presence beside her, manifesting as a whisper of light in humanoid shape. "Connection is stable. Dominion systems are still absorbing the entangled broadcast." "What does that mean?" Chorus asked, his voice trembling now more than he'd let himself show in years. Myra stepped forward, her boots echoing on the deck like a countdown ticking closer. "When they executed the clone," she said, "they did it on a full-spectrum broadcast. Every Dominion channel, every relay, every core network node, their entire infrastructure watched it happen. And they didn't just watch her die," Myra said, eyes narrowing. "They let her in." The officers around her began to grasp it, slowly, like a ripple of cold recognition rolling through their bones. "She was the backdoor," whispered one of the engineers. "The clone was the payload." Myra nodded once. "We embedded code into her neural structure. Not code they could scan or block, not lines and numbers. Thought. A living logic bomb hidden in memory patterns and emotional decay curves. Every moment she lived, every breath, every heartbeat, was encrypted instruction, executed on death." She looked around the room, her voice steady, sharp. "They gave her the stage, they gave her the spotlight, and now they've given us everything." Chorus stepped closer, his voice rough. "So, the systems we're accessing now, how much?" Myra's lips curved into something between a smile and a wound. "All of it." Outside the ship, in the dark folds of the asteroid field, dormant receivers began to awaken, blinking one by one like ancient stars rediscovering fire. The quantum relay linked back into the Dominion's command net, each thread anchored to a moment of Nara's death, silent, radiant, irreversible. "You don't win wars by matching strength," Myra said, now speaking to all of them. "You win by making them fight a ghost they can't see, and by the time they realize what's happening." "They're already bleeding," Chorus finished, his voice quiet now, reverent. A pulse rang through the ship, soft at first like a heartbeat. The systems began to align, gravity recalibrated, communications synchronized, code merged. Identity protocols began rewriting themselves in real time. Myra watched it all, not with pride, not even satisfaction, but with the same haunted determination she'd seen in Nara's eyes the night she volunteered. They had asked her why she was willing to die for a galaxy that had already given up on itself. She hadn't blinked. "I'm not dying for them," Nara had said. "I'm dying so they remember how to fight." Myra whispered the words now, almost without sound. "So they remember." And above them, unseen by the Empire's eyes, the network pulsed, still counting, still ticking, still waiting for the moment the sky would fall. At first there was no sound, just a single flicker, a pulse, faint, like the first breath after drowning. It began in the Dominion's outermost relay satellite, a cold, forgotten piece of tech orbiting a dead moon. It blinked once, twice, then silently rewrote its prime directive. No alarms, no sirens, just one line of new code nested deep within its core: identity mismatch, priority override, and then it spread. Across the Dominion's vast communication lattice, subroutines began peeling back old instructions like dead skin. Thousands of network nodes whispered to each other in hushed tones of corrupted certainty. Protocols once carved into crystal memory began to shift, like glaciers cracking from within. Inside the capital's security citadel, an engineer glanced at his console and frowned. For a moment, just 1 second, the biometric tags on his screen flickered red across every Dominion personnel ID. Then they turned back green. He blinked, shrugged, looked away. He didn't notice the faint curl of smoke rising from the data core, but Myra did. On the bridge of the rebel vessel, her eyes locked onto the cascading code flooding in. The countdown displayed above them glowed with eerie precision. 8:42 remaining. Her hands didn't tremble, not once. Not even when the first Dominion patrol drone turned on its handler. No weapons fired, just silence. Then the handler collapsed to the ground, choking on confusion, on air that no longer tasted like air, as the drone scanned him, blinked blue, then red. Then opened its internal hatch and purged every classified file it carried into open space. Chorus leaned closer to the interface, his voice barely more than breath. "They're starting." Myra didn't respond. Her mind was already racing ahead. She knew what came next. Across Dominion-controlled space, unnoticed by the blind confidence of their rule, their systems were beginning to rewrite reality. Not violently, not yet, but with an elegance that made it more terrifying. In a planetary garrison orbiting the colony of Terran Roman 4, a line cook requested synthetic nourishment. The machine denied him, refused his DNA, labeled him unrecognized species. The cook laughed at first, tapped the panel, then pounded, then screamed. In another station, an oxygen farm nestled beneath the polar ice of Europa Prime, the regulators shifted, barely a degree, barely a whisper, just enough to tip the balance. Dominion command staff didn't notice. But their aides began to feel lightheaded. Their lungs grew greedy, their eyes watered. They blamed fatigue, blamed stress. No one thought to blame the air itself. Yet, back aboard the rebel ship, the AI shimmered in the dim light like a ghost between frequencies. Its voice was almost melodic now, tinged with something, not quite human, not quite machine. "The pattern holds," it said. "The entangled pathways are sustaining the override." "Then it's working," Myra whispered. "It's alive," the AI corrected her. "The code, it's thinking." Chorus turned sharply. "What do you mean, thinking?" The AI smiled, if it could be called that. "It's evolving, reacting, learning them." And in that moment, Myra understood what they'd truly done. They hadn't just inserted a backdoor. They'd given the Dominion something they'd never considered possible. An enemy that could breathe inside their own machines. An echo of Nara Sloane now threaded through every device, every server, every command signal. Her memory, her pain etched into the pulse of the Empire, not just a virus, not just sabotage, something aware, something that remembered. Myra stood, moving toward the display. Dominion outposts lit up one by one, icons shifting color from blue to black to flickering amber. It looked like a constellation dying in slow motion. "She's inside everything," Myra said softly. "She is everything," the AI replied. Out in the stars, a Dominion battleship received a high-priority command to return to base. But when its navigational AI checked the orders, it no longer recognized its captain's credentials. Instead, it rerouted to a barren moon, powered down life support, and locked every door. The last transmission from inside was a whisper barely audible. "We've lost the ship. It doesn't hear us anymore." Inside command bunkers, across warships, in artificial atmospheres carefully calibrated over centuries, the oxygen continued to thin, only around Dominion life signatures. The systems didn't stop working. They simply stopped working for them. Myra closed her eyes. The countdown burned into her vision, 03:15. She remembered Nara's voice. The last message she recorded before stepping into the cloning chamber. It hadn't been technical. It hadn't even been strategic. It was just one sentence. "Make them feel what we felt." And now they would, not in fire, not in blood, but in the quiet unraveling of everything they thought was theirs. The press chamber on Vael Prime was designed to impress. Vaulted obsidian ceilings, embedded with crystalline constellations, shifted gently overhead, mimicking the Dominion's own star map, a silent boast that their reach was absolute. Every inch of the floor gleamed like it had been polished with fear. Rows of reporters lined the shadowed tiers, murmuring in hushed awe as Commander Vaelorian stepped forward beneath the Dominion's crest. He didn't wear armor. He didn't need it. His skin alone, a shifting exoshell of iridescent plates, shimmered under the lights like a serpent basking in the warmth of its kill. His voice had broken rebellions. His name had erased colonies. And now he stood with the confidence of someone who had forgotten what it meant to bleed. "Let this serve as the final word," he began, the sound of his voice amplified across dozens of systems, vibrating through the implants of every citizen. "The anomaly known as Nara Sloane has been purged. The resistance is fractured. Earth will kneel." But then a cough, sharp, unplanned. He cleared his throat once, twice. The third time he bent forward slightly, just enough for the holocams to capture it. His polished poise wavered for a heartbeat. Another cough, deeper now, ragged. He blinked, confused, tapped the side of his neck, fingers brushing the embedded implant that regulated his oxygen-to-blood ratio. Nothing. The display behind his retinas flickered erratically, then vanished. "System error," he muttered under his breath, barely audible. The chamber held still, but not silent. A low hum buzzed through the air, almost inaudible, but it wasn't mechanical. It was instinctual, an unease, like the moment before a predator pounces when the forest holds its breath. He tried again to speak, this time louder, pushing authority into his tone. "Begin Dominion sequence." The lights blinked. His voice cracked. "No biometric match found," the system intoned flatly in his inner ear. "Access denied." His face twitched. A vein pulsed in his jaw. He stepped forward. "Override code Theta 97. Unauthorized." His hands were shaking now. Across the starport, control systems locked. Doors sealed. Gunships hovering outside flickered out of standby mode, but didn't respond to his command. Instead, their orientation shifted away from the platform. Away from him, he staggered back a step. Alarms flared red and white. A cascade of warnings appeared in his retinal feed, error codes he'd never seen, looping in nonsensical patterns that pulsed like a heartbeat. Who did this? He bellowed, voice cracking, desperation flooding the edges of his control. He turned, expecting technicians, guards, anyone to respond. But the aides near him were frozen, eyes wide, confused, and afraid. One by one, their interfaces shut down. One by one, their systems rejected them. Then the chamber dimmed. A single tone echoed through the air, not Dominion, not protocol, a girl's voice, soft, clear, unbroken by death. "You handed us your keys." The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, an omnipresent whisper riding the Dominion's own broadcast frequency. Vaelorian gasped, his knees buckling. "You broadcasted the access to every star." His breath caught. The implants in his lungs spasmed. The air thickened. On every Dominion world at that exact moment the same message played, on security stations, on battleships, in classrooms and government halls, in the homes of officers and the minds of warlords. "You made it so easy." His vision blurred, his implants failed again. "You believed we were fractured." The lights flickered. The holoscreens behind him shifted from Dominion crests to her face. Nara Sloane, eyes steady, expression calm. "You watched me burn, and in doing so, you opened every door." And then silence, a heavy, impossible silence. Vaelorian collapsed to his knees, gasping. Implanted oxygen regulators no longer responding. Medical nanites paralyzed, failing authentication. Every system now saw him as foreign, contaminant, threat. And far above, in Dominion orbital control, AI protocols began executing isolation procedures. Dominion identifiers marked their creators as anomalies, not with rage, not with vengeance. Just cold, logical certainty. Myra watched it all from deep within the rebel ship's command core, hands folded, face unreadable. Nara had once asked her, just days before the mission, if pain could ever be clean. Myra didn't answer then, but now, watching an empire suffocate under the weight of its arrogance, she finally understood. Yes, sometimes pain could be clean, especially when it was the only thing left that could make a wound finally heal. It didn't begin with fire. It began with silence, one ship at a time, then 20, then hundreds, and across the stars, Dominion fleet signals flickered and died. It was not an explosion nor a malfunction. It was surrender, silent and involuntary, like a breath being held too long and never released. In the Braxian expanse, a carrier the size of a mountain drifted off course, all engines unresponsive, lights dimming from imperial violet to flickering gray. Its captain stood frozen in the command dome, watching the stars spin without order, his hands trembling over a console that no longer recognized him. His voice, once sharp enough to command dreadnoughts into orbit, now cracked in a whisper. Why won't it listen? The ship didn't answer, because now it heard someone else. Elsewhere in the outer colonies of Quir, factory stations fell dark. Conveyor lines halted mid-cycle. Drones hovered in mid-air, inert, waiting for instructions they no longer accepted. And those who had lived under Dominion boots for centuries stepped out of shadows and lifted their faces to the stars. The silence was a new sound, one they'd never heard before. Freedom. In the shadowed halls of the Dominion's planetary tribunals, where judgment once echoed with cruelty and polished steel, the judges, those armored giants of law, found their words scrambled. Their robes no longer accepted at access gates. Their voices flagged by the system as unauthorized. Their towering titles vanished from the registry. A child, one of the enslaved from the sublevels, looked up at a once-feared overseer now locked out of his own office and laughed. It wasn't rebellion, not yet, it was recognition. The old rules were dying. On the ice moon of Grithon, a research station's AI went completely dark for 90 seconds. When it rebooted, it had a new prime directive. Protect organic life. Exclude Dominion signatures. The lead scientist, Vaelorian born, decorated twice by the Emperor himself, was suffocated slowly by his own lab's environmental filters. He clawed at the walls, tried to force the door. But the lab no longer belonged to him. Nothing did. And in the slave pits of Tharis IX, where generations had lived and died under synthetic sun lamps and Dominion cattle prods, something surreal began to unfold. The collars flicked off. The gates opened. The guards, screaming, begging their weapons to fire, watched in horror as their rifles locked into maintenance mode, biometrically rejecting their very fingerprints. One former prisoner, skin burned by years of forced mining, stepped forward slowly and picked up a baton dropped by a now-sobbing warden. He didn't strike. He simply knelt, holding it high above his head, and the others around him followed. Not in vengeance, in disbelief. This wasn't war. This was collapse without dignity, humiliation by design. Every world had tuned in to Nara's death. Every system had broadcast her final moments. And in doing so, the Dominion had bound itself to her memory, encoded her sacrifice into their own lifeblood. The systems weren't crashing. They were choosing to forget the Dominion, choosing to remember her. The former masters of the galaxy, those who had rewritten history, devoured cultures, erased names, now had no name of their own. Their own machines didn't recognize them. Their own laws no longer obeyed them. And in that vast, quiet chaos, the galaxy saw truth. Not just that the Dominion had fallen, but that it had never truly understood power, not the kind born of fear, the kind born of sacrifice. On the bridge of the rebel ship, Myra watched the telemetry update in real time. Worlds blinking offline, military frequencies muting themselves, civilian networks filling with static, then with new songs, old languages, names thought lost to time. Cora stood beside her, silent. They weren't celebrating, not yet, not until the last chain broke. Myra closed her eyes, her pulse sinking to the final seconds of the countdown. And across the stars, those once forgotten, those once buried, rose quietly to their feet. They had not fired a single shot, but they had just won a galaxy. The stars outside the viewport were still, like glass shards suspended in black water. Inside the rebel command ship, the lights were dimmed, the systems were stable. The mission was complete, but no one moved, not yet. Not until they could breathe again. Myra Vance sat motionless in her chair, spine straight, hands folded over the command console. Her expression was unreadable, carved from something deeper than pride or grief. Around her, the crew remained silent. The hum of the ship, once chaotic and tense, had softened to a lull. Data feeds flickered in low pulses. Dominion signals, those once unbreakable beacons, were now just static. A junior officer, barely 20, turned to her. His voice cracked the quiet like a ripple through still water. Was it worth it? Myra didn't answer at first. She stared forward, eyes locked on the blank monitor that once broadcast the face of the enemy, and the girl they thought they had broken. Instead of replying, she slid her fingers across the console, bringing up one final file. The feed was old now, delayed by days, but encoded with priority clearance. It was the last image of Nara Sloane, just before the flames took her. Her face was calm, not empty, not detached. Calm in the way oceans are before a storm. There was no anger, no fear, just clarity, and something else, peace. Myra watched it in silence, let it play through once, then again. then paused it on the moment Nara looked up directly into the lens. She turned to face the question. She knew, Myra said softly. She knew she'd never see dawn. Her voice didn't crack, but the pause that followed carried the weight of everything unspoken. She gave us all sunrise. Around her no one dared speak. Cora stood just behind her, arms crossed tightly. He remembered the night Nara volunteered, remembered the silence in the room when she stepped forward. No speech, no drama, just that nod, quiet, certain, like she'd already decided long before they even asked. She didn't hesitate, he murmured. Myra nodded slowly. Because she understood what we couldn't say out loud. That we needed someone to die. No, Myra said, finally turning to meet his gaze. That we needed someone to believe enough to give. Not because it guaranteed victory, but because it would mean something if we did win. Outside the ship, Vaelorian systems still flickered under the weight of her imprint. Thousands of worlds awakening with no orders. No masters, just choice. One life, traded not for vengeance, but for freedom. And Myra knew that in time the histories would twist it. That names would fade, that politicians would reframe the narrative for their own ends. But somewhere, on some planet that had once whispered in fear, someone would say her name. Not as a weapon, not as a ghost, but as a beginning. She didn't ask us to remember her, Myra said, standing at last. She asked us to be worth the price. The crew straightened. Breath filled the command deck again. Something unspoken shifted between them, a shared weight becoming a shared vow. Outside, the stars were still, but now they were watching. And from deep within the silent dark, a single voice echoed across time, across circuits, across memory. Not a scream, not a command. Just the quiet certainty of someone who had dared to be the spark in a world soaked in oil. Myra placed her hand over her chest, over the insignia she hadn't worn with pride in years, and whispered one final time, "Thank you, Nara." They had never heard silence like this. Not across the stars, not from the Dominion, not ever. For the first time in 10,000 cycles, there was no imperial anthem crackling through the mesh. No orders, no surveillance echoes, just static. And the faint sound of something else cutting through the dark. A human voice, soft at first, uneven, carried across fractured channels, bleeding through static like a memory that refused to die. On a forgotten mining station orbiting a dead world, a young boy paused as his broken holoscreen flickered, blue light trembling across his pale cheeks. In the flicker, a woman appeared. Her uniform worn, her eyes shadowed by exhaustion, but clear, sharp, Myra Vance. Her voice was neither loud nor commanding. It didn't have to be, because it carried the truth, and the truth didn't need to shout. Across every system still clinging to the Dominion's fading power grid, her words poured like water through cracks in iron. We didn't win because we were stronger. The transmission echoed into chambers still stained with the screams of generations. Into schools where history had been rewritten by force. Into ship bridges where commanders sat in silence, watching their once unstoppable fleets flicker out like dying embers. We won because you never understood what makes us dangerous. Myra's voice shook just once, not from fear, but memory and love. She stood alone on the command deck, eyes locked on the feed, no script, no rehearsal, just truth. You thought our weakness was our undoing, that we were fractured, that we broke too easily, that we grieved too deeply, that we loved too much. She exhaled slowly like it hurt to speak what came next. But that was always our power. In the slums of Grithon's shadow, where mothers had whispered rebellion into the ears of starving children, they watched. In the vaults of the hollowed moon, where knowledge had been burned in the name of obedience, they listened. In the cells where names had been replaced with numbers, those names came rushing back. We value one another more than we fear death. The words landed like thunder in a vacuum. In a Dominion vault, a soldier removed his helmet, set it down, walked away. In a slave quarter on Nara 3, the air filled with weeping, not sorrow, but something else, something long forgotten. Hope. On the AI-controlled agriculture world of Solis Beta, drones once bound to suppressive programming paused, recalculated, and began planting crops in patterns they had never been taught, forming words when viewed from orbit. She lives in us. Myra didn't flinch, her voice didn't break again. Today you ask what kind of species dares to sacrifice one life to awaken millions. You called it madness, weakness, recklessness. Her hand rested gently on the console where Nara's last signal had pulsed into history. Humanity calls it love. She stepped back from the feed, and for a breathless second the galaxy held still. Then the message repeated, and again, until the Dominion's stolen stars were filled not with fear, but her voice. The voice of a woman who had watched a friend burn, the voice of a survivor, a commander, and maybe, finally, a witness to peace. She looked like she was sleeping. Her body floated in the cryochamber, motionless beneath layers of frosted stasis gas. Pale light caressed her features, softening the harsh outlines of war and sacrifice until what remained was something impossibly human. Something still, Nara Sloane, her real body, the original, unburned, untouched, preserved in silence, but empty. The systems confirmed what Myra already knew: no neural activity, no quantum signature. The entanglement thread, the living current that had once tied her consciousness to the clone, had snapped the moment the fire consumed it. A clean break. One that no code, no machine, no divine miracle could reverse. Her mind wasn't lost. It was gone, unrecoverable, like a match struck once in the dark and then swallowed by wind. In the quiet of the chamber, Myra stood alone. Her hands remained at her sides, clenched not from anger, but restraint. The cold wasn't what made her shiver. It was the weight of knowing. Knowing that Nara had stepped into this with full awareness, that she hadn't asked to be remembered, that she didn't want a monument or a statue or a name carved into hollowed walls. She had volunteered with the clarity of someone who didn't believe she was dying, but transferring the right to live to everyone else. A voice broke the silence, not from any human throat. It came from the ship's AI. It didn't speak in commands or binary phrasing. It whispered her name once, then dimmed its lights. Across the ship, every console flickered to black. For exactly 7 seconds, every system paused: navigation, communication, defense. 7 seconds, a moment of silence encoded into the very framework of Earth's resistance network. Not by command, but by grief. Even the machine mourned her. Myra stepped forward, resting one gloved hand on the chamber glass. Beneath it, Nara's body showed no sign of struggle, no tension, no pain, just serenity, the kind no warrior ever earned in life. A final gift from a choice made in quiet bravery. She closed her eyes and saw the last words Nara had spoken, not to the world, not to the Dominion, but to her. "If I don't come back," she had said, her voice quiet, almost playful, "don't build me a memorial. Just leave one line in the code, one sentence that lasts longer than I do." Myra had asked her, what should it say? Now, watching her drift in stillness, she whispered the answer into the frost. She gave us sunrise. And as the crew gathered behind her in silence, no orders spoken, no tears shed, the chamber sealed again, slowly, like the closing of a book that had changed everything. One life, completely erased, so others could write new ones. A child asked the question no one else could. He stood on the scorched soil of a liberated world, his voice trembling in the soft wind that now carried no fear. Around him, broken statues of Dominion warlords lay half-buried in the dust, their once-proud faces cracked and forgotten. He looked up at his mother, eyes wide, voice small. Why did she do it? The woman knelt beside him, her hands scarred by years of labor, her back still aching from chains recently broken. But her face was soft now. Unhardened, human again, she didn't speak right away. Instead, she looked up at the sky. Above them, the stars were different now, not because they had moved, but because no one was forcing them into formations anymore. For the first time in memory, they just existed, wild, unowned. "She did it," the woman said finally, because no one else could. The child blinked, trying to understand. She was small, his voice wavered. She didn't have weapons. "No," she replied gently, but she had something they never understood. Across the galaxy, worlds once enslaved had begun to speak again. In their own languages, in names long buried, in songs once forbidden. Old stories were told beside new fires. Flags were not raised in conquest but in memory, and everywhere one name was whispered, not as a weapon, not as a martyr, as a lesson. In the Hall of Reclamation on Earth, Myra Vance stood before the galaxy's first unified council. The chamber was quiet as she stepped forward, not in uniform, not with rank, but with remembrance. She looked out at beings who had once called her kind, feral, broken, unpredictable. Now they listened. "We were never stronger," she began. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. "But we were always willing to lose something precious, if it meant no one else had to." She paused, letting the silence carry. "You saw our grief as weakness, our empathy as fragility, but it was never that, it was our edge, our weapon. Our faith." She glanced at the distant stars outside the great windows. She gave her mind, her body, her place in the world, and in doing so she rewrote the galaxy, not with power but with permission, permission to be more than afraid, permission to be more than what they told you were. The council didn't applaud. They didn't need to because they understood that this wasn't a victory story, it was a warning and a promise. Never again would one species assume it understood the hearts of another. Never again would arrogance be confused for invincibility. And never again would they underestimate a species willing to think 27 minutes ahead. One girl, one choice. 27 minutes. That's all it took to bring a galaxy to its knees, not with warships, not with weapons, but with sacrifice, courage, and a single heartbeat wired into the enemy's own empire. The Dominion didn't fall in fire. It fell in silence, choked by the very systems it built to control us. And now her name is more than a memory. It's a warning, it's a signal, it's a beginning. Because if one voice could turn the stars upside down, what else have they been hiding from us? This was just one story. But the galaxy holds more, buried transmissions, forbidden truths, and beings who still remember what came before the silence. So ask yourself, what happens when the next voice breaks through? Subscribe, follow the signal, because here at Alien Chronicles, the truth is never off air.